Hi, I'm Amy. Thank you for tuning in. Today, I'm joined by one of my favourite middle grade authors, the absolutely brilliant Lorien. If you haven't read her books before, I would describe them as sort of a modern day R.L. Stine, but way better. And Lorien is the author of the Fright series, the first two books of which are already out, and the third is coming very soon. So welcome, Lorien. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat with you about all things spooky.
Me too. And I think it'd be interesting to see our different take on from middle grade to YA. And I know you write some way too, so we can get into all of that in a little while. So first, can you start off by telling us a little bit about your three books?
Sure, I'd love to. So my series is called Fright. And the first book is called The Stitchers. You can see the beautiful cover.
It is beautiful. It's amazing.
I'm kind of obsessed, and I know it's my book, but I would still be obsessed if it weren't my book. The design team was so good. And The Stitchers is about Quinn and Mike, who are on the cover. They are on the running team. They're 13 years old. They're in middle school. Quinn unfortunately lost her father a year before the story starts. And so she's kind of dealing with the grief, and ways that she connected with her father when he was alive was running. And having these weird theories about their neighbors who are called the oldies, because they don't seem to age. They're not necessarily getting any younger, but they're in too good of a shape for how old they're supposed to be. And they're always bandaged up. And then when they're not bandaged, they look pristine, and something is up with them. And they're giving these super sinister vibes. And so Quinn decides to, kind of honor her father's memory by figuring out the truth about these neighbors. So she pulls in Mike, who is her friend, maybe crush, and they go on this investigation together, and they find out the truth. They do figure out the mystery, and it's way creepier than they thought. And it's actually more dangerous than they ever imagined. And they realize that they're in danger if they don't figure out how to stop them. So that is book one. Book two is called The Collectors, and it picks up exactly where book one leaves off. New neighbors at the very end of The Stitchers, in the epilogue. New neighbors, you see these like beautiful ladies in white move in where the oldies used to live. And Quinn is immediately suspicious. Mike is dealing with some symptoms of PTSD from the first book. Like, he's having nightmares. He's up all night. He's still trying to unpack what happened to them. So he wants none of this. He does not want to think that there's something else, supernatural or bad happening in their town. But she eventually convinces him, because they realize that her best friend Lex is in danger from these women. They're pulling her in. It's kind of like a ghost cult scenario, and they have to figure out how to stop them and save their friend. Book three comes out August 30th in the US, and it is called Unmasked. I don't have a book yet to show you, but here is the cover. You can see
really cool.
I do love this one. And this was, side note, tangent, this is a different artist than the one who did the first two books.
I think they fit really nicely together.
They managed to kind of have the same vibe of them. So you see Quinn and Mike are still in this book, but they are not the main character. The main character is this young lady named Marion Jones. So this is kind of a companion novel. Again, Marion is the main character. She is a 14-year-old monster maker. I'm super obsessed with special effects, especially for horror movies. I've always been obsessed with watching TV specials about how they do the special effects in movies and monster making. And so I've always wanted to write something about a monster maker. So Marion is a monster maker. She is a loner. She has a social anxiety disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. And she doesn't really feel comfortable interacting with people. She only feels confident when she's making her art, when she's making her monsters. And so she makes her first full mask, which is a sea monster she affectionately names Winston. And her crush ends up putting it on, and it possesses him, and he turns into a sea creature and goes to the Halloween dance to wreak havoc on his fellow classmates. And so Marion has to kind of work up the courage to go to this social situation that makes her incredibly anxious and confront somebody, which also makes her incredibly anxious, and try to get her mask back and save everybody. So Quinn and Mike are there. They end up working with Marion, but they are not the main characters in this one. So it was kind of fun to write from a different point of view, but in the same universe. So that's
so
Fright
cool.
Watch.
Yeah, I didn't realize that the next book was going to be focusing on different characters. So are you going to be doing any more Quinn and Mike stories in the future? Or is the idea that it will kind of morph and go with different people?
I have I have 6 books total planned. So this is 3. I had 2 more through Quinn's point of view and 1 through another character's point of view. But we'll see if my publisher wants more Fright Watch or not. But yeah, I always have to have like the end of something planned. So even if the next 3 don't sell or get bought by my publisher, I feel like it just helped me to know how Quinn and Mike's story would end.
Yeah, I was the same with mine. My agent came up with the titles for mine, like the Mina and the structure. And at that first conversation with her, literally, I kind of, in my head, I knew what the 3 books would be if I got to write them. So I think it is helpful. I was going to ask you about that, actually. How do you find writing a series? Because I found it a lot more taxing than I expected to try and keep all those details in my head and like make sure that it grows in the right way. Like, what's your experience with that? Because I think you're a little bit further down the process than me.
I love writing a series because I feel like I'm quicker because I already have the voice and that universe.
Yeah.
But I do agree that there's a lot to keep track of. And so that can be time consuming to go back and look at the Bibles that the publisher makes, or looking back at all of my notes to make sure I'm not messing something up, or, that a character feels like, yeah, in mine, they age a little bit each year. And I mean, I teach middle school in my day-to-day life. And so I teach this age group, and the difference between a 6th grader who's 11, a 7th grader who is 12, and an 8th grader who is 13 or 14, they're like different human beings between each one of those years. So to try to make my characters grow and be a little bit more mature, but still the ridiculous middle schooler they're allowed to be, I feel like that has been a little bit challenging. But voice wise and universe wise, I like that I already have those built. It does take a little bit of effort to make sure that I'm not messing up the world that I previously established. But I love that you have. Are you allowed to say like what would the title be for a 3rd Mina?
No, so I don't. I'm not allowed to announce it. I will tell you after. Sorry, everybody else. But yeah,
I get to know the secret.
Yeah, you do. I will be able to announce it fairly shortly. Hopefully, nothing has been set in stone with a book 3 yet. But yes, it will focus quite a bit on Mina's family. So that, yes. So I just wanted to talk a little bit then after writing series. The other thing that really struck me as I was listening to your blurbs, it sort of reminded me that in your books, your characters deal with a lot of things. Like they're not just dealing with a monster. It makes me think of things like Buffy, where Buffy isn't just dealing with a monster of the week. She's dealing with what it's like to be a 16-year-old girl, boyfriends and things like that. Like, is that something that you consciously wanted to draw on, like the full experience of what it is to be a human and to be a human of that particular age?
Absolutely. I do try to make a conscious effort to think about, what's their internal conflict? What are they battling with in their personal life? And then what is this huge external conflict that like affects the bigger world or their community? So I do try to really think of that when I write. And I feel like that helps me to hopefully make the characters feel more real and relatable. Because I do think that our genre, whether it's YA like you or middle grade or adult or anything within the horror space, I feel like we get a lot of, slack of it being, oh, it's genre fiction. So it's not doesn't have all these, important things or whatever. And it's like so much of the horror that I read and watch and love does have, these this blend of internal and external conflict. So I do try to be aware of that. Mina has that going on for sure. And I love that about your series. Yeah, I do think it's important. It can't just be monsters.
Yeah, we're not. I mean, even when you think of things like I Know What You Did Last Summer, which is what, a 90-minute horror film. I'm saying this like I know you'll have watched it. Of course you will.
Oh, of course I have. Yeah.
Probably many times. There's just so many layers, isn't there? Even in that, you think of the characters have done something terrible together, and they're all dealing with that in different ways, whether it's denial or like facing it head on. And I think that in a book we can unpick that even more. So why wouldn't we? Especially, I think in my second book, I've just gone wild and had an extra 100 pages. And a lot of that is exploring like fallout of the first book, and things that I sometimes stupidly set into motion in book one. Like, why did I do that to that character? I've got to like really see this one through now. So yeah, I do think that genre fiction does tend to get a bad reputation. Then when people actually go to read it, they're like, oh, this is what genre fiction is. Okay, I'm going to read some more of that now. And some people have said that to me about YA as well, that they've read my book thinking, well, it's vampires, I'll give it a go. And actually, wow, YA fiction can be deep and meaning. And I don't even think,
all of those things.
And mine, I don't think it was the deepest book either. So it's funny, like there's a lot of people who go to a lot of greater depths than I do. I think some parts of mine can be quite superficial. But sorry, I think you were going to say something as well.
Oh, I was just gonna echo this and say that I did an event pretty recently with a non-spooky horror author who was writing like their first middle grade, and it was contemporary, and our books were nothing alike. She was lovely though, but she did make a comment saying that in contemporary or realistic fiction, you have the kids are going through something emotional, and she kind of looked at me and was like, that doesn't happen in your books, right? And I was like, oh no, it does. That's a thing in horror. It's just
have you read my book before we did this event together?
they're very emotional stories, I feel like.
Sometimes and I think that's part of emotional. Like I'd say your book deals with some of the like more unsettling and difficult things for a child to deal with. Like one of the most difficult things has to be losing a parent, and you tackle that head on in your, silly little genre fiction book.
Yeah.
And can we just say, while we're talking about genre fiction, what attracted me to read your book, even before we'd spoken to each other, I saw that you had a blurb by Stephen King on the front, and me as an author, I kind of went, oh, I think I just made a little noise, like, if Stephen King says he likes the book, I'll just buy it, no questions asked. So number one, how did that happen? And number two, how did that feel when it happened?
So I have the most lovely editor of any, like I would follow Emily DeLugo to the end of the earth in terms of books. Like she loves horror and like genuinely knows it. We have this shorthand that she can be like, can you make this part a little more Midsummer? Can you make this a little more, Fright Night? Like we get that shorthand with each other. So when Stitchers was being prepped or whatever, we were finished the edits, and she said like blurbs for middle grade, my publisher's kind of view on it is unless it's a really big name, she doesn't feel like they really can make or break a book. And so she's like, is there any pie in the sky or someone like you would just, want to ask? And so I said, Stephen King is from, I think he was born in Maine and then grew up in Stratford for a bit and then went back to Maine. But Stratford, Connecticut is where I grew up. Oh, wow. And that's where he got the inspiration for it. Like that's what he says in his book on writing. Wow. And so he, and that is Stratford, Connecticut. It was my inspiration for the fictional South Haven, Connecticut, which is where the Fright Watch series is set. So the library that Quinnen might go to, like that is the same library Stephen King at one point in his life went to. And I've always found that really cool. And he's talked about Connecticut in interviews and things like that. And I feel like people have this perception of what Connecticut is because of like Martha Stewart and Greenwich and Westport, all these really rich, fancy places. And there's so much folklore here. It's like such a weird little place that I always thought it was cool that we had this like connection with this town. And so that was my pie. And I was like, I know he doesn't review children's books or whatever. Like, I get it. But as my pie in the sky, like, can we ask him, because it has Stratford like in its bones? And she was like, sure. And so she reached out to his agent, and his agent just forwarded it to Stephen King, and Stephen King like wrote back himself to my editor. So she was freaking out. I was in school teaching, and I was using my phone. I always use my phone as a timer. And so, if they're doing an activity. And so I was holding it and looking at the time, and I just see an email pop up. And it was from Emily. And in all capitals, the subject line was, Stephen King is going to read your book. So then I obviously open it in front of my students and I start freaking out in front of them, and they like it's so unprofessional, but it was such like a like cool moment for me to share with them, and they started freaking out because they all know who he is. And then like a couple weeks later, she had immediately that day sent him my arc, and then a couple weeks later I was doing the same kind of thing. Like people are going to think I'm on my phone when I'm teaching. I'm not, but I was doing like the timer thing with literally that same class. It was just this weird thing. And that time the subject line again was all caps, and it was like, Stephen King loved your book. So it was like surreal. It was very, very cool.
So very much deserved. That is amazing. And I think that the fact that that connection maybe just set it over the top, and it just shows that you might as well like reach out if you've got somebody
like the worst he would have said was no, which is what I was expecting. And then Emily and I both said, like, even when he said yes, send me the arc, like we both had this vision. Like I've seen photos of his desk and how messy it is. I had this vision of the book just sitting there and never to be touched or read, etc. So we were both like shocked that, and mine was one of the first books I think that Emily has edited. So I think that was quite cool for her as well, to like be able to email with Stephen King.
That is so cool. Oh, that is such a lovely story about Stephen King. I don't know if I'd even be able to still function if I got an email like that. Hopefully one day. Maybe I'll ask.
I think I was useless for the rest of the day.
I'm sure your kids were really proud of you. That's so lovely though. And to know that their teacher has written books must be a super cool thing as well. Like, do they think that's quite cool? Do they understand that you're the same person, or?
They're funny because I try not to, at the beginning of the year when I introduce myself and tell them about myself, I do show them my books and say I'm an author. And then the only other time I really bring it up is when we do have this really fun creative writing unit where they write their own stories and I teach them how to do it, etc. So then I'll bring it up then. But other than that, I don't want to be that author that's like, read my book, like it's weird, it's uncomfortable, so I don't do it. But the 6th grade teachers are lovely, and they book talk my books all the time with them, so by the time they get to me in 7th, they know. But I use a different last name at school, so they don't always make that connection that their teacher is also Lorien Lawrence. One of them did ask me at the end of the year, the librarian was doing had like this cute little book tasting with all books on different tables, and she had mine to get them hyped for summer reading, and she had mine on one of the tables. And so one of my students like, oh, this is your book, and another student looked at her and looked at me, like did a whole up and down and was like, that's your book? Wait, are you rich? Are you famous? Why are you here? And I was like, oh, darling, no.
We make pennies per book, but thank you for
pennies
asking.
For books, but thank you for inquiring.
Do you have a US equivalent? We get asked, UK authors get J.K. Rowling, so it's like, oh, you're going to be the next J.K. Rowling, and we get, I've never heard that before. Do you have a US equivalent, or do you get her too?
No, I don't get her. No, actually, they don't really ask me. Like students don't really ask me. I think adults will say R.L. Stine, but like students, they don't also, my students don't really know author names that much. So they might know a book series. Like they would know this is Fright Wash, but they wouldn't remember the author's name to even like put it together with me. So a lot of them don't even know who R.L. Stine is, but they know Goosebumps.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a weird thing where the author names don't stick as much. Like they would know J.K. Rowling, like someone who's in pop culture that they hear the name a lot, but if it's just they won't necessarily know unless it was a secret.
Yeah, I'd say similar actually, probably. Like when I'm thinking of like Louis Stoll, who wrote the Loki books, like I'd say the kids would probably say Loki, whereas if it's something like David Williams where they were the celebrity to begin with, they'd probably say his books. And then the teacher would say, let's try reading something as well as that, and so on.
Yes, the celebrity book thing that's a stressful conversation.
Yeah, it is. That could be should we do a whole extra event about that? I'm sure lots of authors would like to join us. But yeah, so one thing I'm really interested in with your books is obviously you write YA and you write middle grade, and the middle grade, the ones you've had published at the moment. Do you have to consciously like flip some kind of switch when you're writing them, or like I was just wondering, how do you navigate the different audiences? Because I found your first books, like your middle grade, scary. Like they scared me. But how do you know how far to go and say, okay, that's the end of middle grade, like right there. I don't want to go over that line.
I don't know the official rule on this, but I know the rule that I follow is that like middle grade, you want to be hopeful, especially middle grade horror. Like you want kids to read and kind of know that it's going to be okay in the end, but that struggle along the way is what they're, what is like, how is it going to be okay in the end? And that's one of the things that I love about middle grade horror, especially, is like you can have these horrific, like the Stitchers is ridiculous. Like the whole concept of it, like of what the oldies, it gets ridiculous. But like you want the kids to be successful. And in YA, you don't have to have that level of hope. I like hopeful books. That's just the kind of person I am. That's the kind of, like, I like hope and humor in my horror. If something is bleak from beginning to end, I struggle more with it. And so I still try to keep that little string of hope. But like, oh my goodness, when I was like writing, just drafts of my YA manuscripts, I was like, "Ooh, I can do this. I can make this really dark. I can show a lot of like more gore." And it's kind of like those scenes, I was kind of pulling back a little, and then I realized, oh no, I can do that. Oh no, I can say that. I can swear here. I can, you know. So I think it's like, yeah, I think in middle grade you want to have a little bit of hope and humor so that kids feel like, okay, I'm seeing another kid like me being brave, and being successful, that it's not just wasted bravery, or look, they put themselves out there and it was a mistake. They shouldn't have done that. Whereas I feel like in YA you could do that. Like things can go terribly wrong. So maybe that I haven't sold any YA yet, so I don't know like how much hope matters in that. But I feel like that's just the kind of reader, viewer, and author that I am. Is I do feel like I need that, which is why I also love your series, because it does have like humor and it has hope, and you do go there with the gruesome bits that I can't really go in with middle grade. And so, but it kind of can keep me through.
Yeah, I think you did the relationship side beautifully as well, because I remember being that age and like having a little crush and having a boyfriend who you go to the park with and sit on the next swing to him, like that kind of thing. I think you handled that really well, because I know that in YA, obviously the relationship can go kind of as far as you want, depending on the publisher. So yeah, I thought that you handled that really beautifully. I remember those feelings of being like really, really young and not quite knowing what to do with them. So I thought that was lovely, and I think that is a definite difference. It's interesting you say that. As you were talking about horror, I was thinking the kind of horror I like, if people say this is a bleak, relentless, like from beginning to end, I tend to not pick it up now. And I think that I do seek maybe like the kind of slasher things and stuff like that a bit more, like Clown in the Cornfield. I know that it deals with some more difficult subjects, and I think the second book probably will even more, because like you said, in the second one you're dealing with the fallout of the first, in terms of grief and coping and trauma. But I think that I do like Ariel's side of hopeful. Anything that is about completely losing yourself or complete grief and despair, I just find difficult. So I think that I wouldn't probably write something like that. And yeah, maybe that's why I sit more comfortably in the kind of middle grade to YA space because of that. I know that some YA does, dig into some real depths, but I think it's maybe slightly different from adult horror. Some adult horror anyway.
Oh, I completely agree. I did go on like this little adult horror binge over this spring, I think. And it was just like I had books that I could eat up. Like they were absolutely delicious and well written and great. But like after I read it, I had to chase it with like a happy book or like a Disney cartoon, and before I can put myself back into another one.
Oh, we're the same. Is that because we're like teachers of young children and we have this like, maybe we were that type of person, so we went into teaching, or
Maybe.
teaching did that to us, I don't know, but like I feel like hope is so necessary.
Well, because I think we see the kid, like we see what actual kids are like, not just like the TV version or the book version. So they're real humans who are reading this and getting, not influence, that's too strong of a word, but I do think there's so many bad things happening in the world that if you're going to write about a bad thing, at least show the kids that something good can come out of it.
Yeah, so if you've been through something difficult, that life can go on. Yeah, I think you did that really beautifully in your book, so
Thank you.
mission achieved. So on the subject you mentioned about like the dark scenes and knowing how far to go, like how do you tackle writing such sort of creepy atmospheric scenes, is there anything that you do to get yourself in that headspace, or that you consciously in your writing, like how do you amp the scares to that level? Because honestly, I was like, you know, the physical visceral reaction of horror, you did that really, really well. So
Oh,
I
yay.
want to steal it. Like what's your approach for doing that?
Music is really, really important to me, and it sounds like such a trivial answer, but it's so true, and it's always, since I was a kid, been part of my process. Like growing up with MTV and music videos and like having story put to music. And I don't like musicals. I'm not huge on theater, but I always loved music videos. And I feel like that subconsciously influenced me, that I always have to make a playlist when I'm working on a manuscript, and then that becomes like my unofficial soundtrack, so that I have a half an hour commute to work and back every day. So that's like a full hour in the car where I can't write, I can't do anything. I'm trying to transition from teacher to mom mode to author, whatever, you know. And if I put on the soundtrack, then I can kind of choreograph a scene in my head. So all of those like big scenes, like in the Stitchers, the funeral home scene in the basement, like that, I distinctly remember, you know, being in my car on the way to work and just listening to that same song over and over again to choreograph it almost like a music video. And I feel like I always have to do that, and it kind of helps me to write when I'm not writing. And then it's the kind of thing like where if I put it on or I listen to it, even if I'm like on a walk or something, then I can still kind of be doing the work. Because you know, you're a mom and a teacher, like it's a lot of hats to juggle. So any moment when I can write without writing, I feel like music really can help me jump back into the story quicker than if I just pick up a pen or open my computer. So I
Yeah,
think,
that's really
yeah.
interesting, because I find that if general writing, I don't have music on, whereas if there's music playing in the scene, I have to listen to that music when I'm writing the scene. So if it's set in a club or a bar or a party, like I have to play the song. So I stole the song from Buffy, Transylvanian Concubine by Rasputina, which is from this sort of sexy, you probably already know, but anybody who's not as big a Buffy fan, there's like a scene with Spike and Drew where they're listening to this really kind of seductive music, and I put it in one of my scenes in the book, and I had to listen to it on repeat until I got that scene right. I don't know how you teach and write, by the way, because I'm sort of a consultant, so I've stepped away from the teaching side of it. And I think that being a mom and being a teacher and writing, they all take such an emotional contribution. Like, I don't know, you must have like infinite wells of like resilience and kind of get up and go to be able to do that. So I really applaud that. Do you find, is there ever a moment where you do think that it is difficult to sustain it, or have you just found a way of like fitting all of that into your day and into your life?
It is difficult to sustain. The pandemic has made it worse because teaching has changed. And even though we're back in the classroom, it's still different. And so it's been more taxing and challenging. But I've always kind of like my third book, the main character has an anxiety disorder, and I grew up with an anxiety disorder. And one of the things that, well, really two things, have helped me to, you know, maintain a sense of self is exercising, which I'm less good at when I'm stressed because it's the last thing I want to do when I'm tired and already run down. But writing. So I will always make the time for writing because that will help me to settle my mind. Like I'm not going to be stressed about this thing at work if I'm thinking about a scene where a bunch of kids have to battle a monster. So I kind of have always used it as a sort of therapy, which sounds so cheesy and contrite, but it's really true for me. And it's been that way since I was a kid. So it is, I do think there are times where it feels really challenging, but writing has never really felt like a chore for me. It's always felt like that treat, like that thing that's going to help me feel really centered and balanced. So even if like my kids are on top of me needing attention and want to watch like a Disney movie or something, I can have like a little notebook on the side of the couch where I can scribble some ideas down, and doing that I kind of feel a little more centered.
That's really interesting and not trite at all. I think I'm on the anxious side as well, and generally it isn't a big thing for me, but it does occasionally kind of flare up and feel worse when I'm stressed. And I think that I find that escaping to another world, whether it's listening to an audiobook or reading or writing, it kind of gives you that step away from whatever it is that's stressing you out, doesn't it? And then I feel like I can kind of tackle it afterwards. It's like you're not completely blocking the thing out because you have to deal with it at some point, but it just makes you all that kind of body reaction to anxiety, it kind of calms it down, doesn't it? And then you can, I think the exercise thing is really hard as a mum. Like, I feel like that's the one thing that running after a toddler, it feels like good exercise, but it's not the same as doing like an hour of yoga or something to really get myself back in the zone. But yeah, oh, it's so good to listen to you. Like, I feel like we've obviously got a lot of things in common that I didn't even realize we had. So that's really nice. And maybe that's how we've both turned to writing horror. So that's really cool. So maybe that's a good way to segue into that. So what actually made you start writing horror? Like, have you always written that, or did you write other things? Like, what's your kind of journey with that?
So when I was a kid, I started writing stories, like when I learned how to write or whatever, you know, when I learned how to put sentences together. I think I was 6 when I started writing stories. And I always gravitated towards the spooky, magical things, you know, like I loved witches and vampires and I loved being scared. And so I would always write those. And then like I got to college and I majored in English and creative writing, like a dual major. And there was a really big push. I don't know if it was the time that I went to school or if it was all, and I loved my school, but it might have been the time period. Like the book market was very different. It was very heavy push for literary, important fiction. You know, there has to be like a family saga and a big issue and all of these things. And I felt very much pressure to do that. And that's what I ended up, you know, writing more of in college and grad school. And I got away from horror. I still read it and really liked it and loved my horror movies and my horror TV shows, but I wasn't writing it. And it was, talk about my anxiety spiking. Like I didn't make the connection that me not being happy with what I was writing and feeling this pressure to write these important things, in quotes, was making me feel more anxious. And I could not get an agent with anything I wrote. As soon as I got out of grad school, I was like, how old was I? I don't know, early 20s. I was querying constantly because I can write a lot and I can write pretty fast. And so I was constantly churning out these projects and querying and querying and querying and just getting nowhere, like not even responses, just no, not for me, form letters. And then I ended up moving. I was in England for a while. I moved back home and my husband and I bought a house in Stratford, Connecticut, which I talked about earlier. And it was like something about being in the neighborhood where I grew up and I rode my bike and like hung out over here by this convenience store. And then there's the library we used to go to. And there's where we used to look for the witch's stone. And here's the haunted pond. Like being back with all of those urban legends that I grew up with, it like put me in that mindset again. And unfortunately, around that time, my dad suddenly passed away. So I was kind of dealing with, I was dealing with the grief from that, but also being back in this really nostalgic place that I wrote The Stitchers, which was then called Bits and Pieces. I wrote it as a way to kind of just help myself like get through that really difficult time. And I just think it's super serendipitous that that's the book. Once I like had fun writing again and went back to my roots, like literally to the point where I was in my hometown, the place I grew up, that's the book that got published. And all those other like literary, probably super pretentious books never went anywhere. So I think sometimes you have to just kind of go back to the start. And that's what happened with me.
Oh, that's so cool. I think that it's such a thing, isn't it, of writing what you think people want to read and not really realizing that the market will have changed by the time your book comes out. So you might as well just write the thing you want to write. 'Cause when I was writing the Mina books, like why horror wasn't having as much of a moment, it was kind of paranormal romance type stuff if you were going all into fantasy. So I kind of had to just say, no, I still want to write like a horror mystery, bit of romance. And I remember it was Laini Taylor that said in an interview I watched her do, she said that with Daughter of Smoke and Bone, the reason she thinks it did so well is that she put everything that she loved into it and she really made it this passion project. Like she had these creepy little like coffee shops and she had, you know, a girl who wears a bone and like all of that just came together. So I did Laini Taylor and I wrote a big mind map of what I wanted to go into the book. Like I love bones and I love New Orleans and I loved vampires and all of it just was this big tapestry of the stuff that I wanted to write about. And I think that as soon as you try and write the book that other people want you to write, or you like think that other people want to read, it just doesn't feel as
Doesn't
authentic.
work.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's really
Yeah, for
interesting,
sure.
isn't it? That readers can see through that, because you have to kind of pour everything into a book, don't you? And it's if it's not authentic, I think that people can tell, especially like agents and the kind of gatekeepers of the publishing industry. They see so much that they can kind of see through that. So I'm so glad that you
Well,
didn't go down that route. Can you imagine? We could have been
oh
having
my
a really
gosh.
different conversation,
We
or
would,
not
yeah,
talking
probably
at
not be
all.
having a conversation.
Yeah.
And I'd probably be miserable.
Oh,
The market, though, is a funny thing you brought up, because it took me 10 years of straight querying to get an agent. And that was not for the Stitchers. It was for like some kind of like magical book or whatever that I never ended up publishing. But because the response I kept getting by that point was, I really, really like this, but there's not really a market for, I don't know how I'd sell this, which is hilarious, because cut to, now where it's like middle grade horror and spooky middle grade books for kids is like, at least in the US, it's like having a huge moment, to the point where one of my friends who's an established spooky middle grade writer, tried to sell another book, and she got responses from editors saying like, we have a lot of this right now. Like, it's super competitive. Whereas before it was like, hi, we're here. So the market just is constantly evolving. And you are absolutely right. Like, you can't chase a market if you're a writer. You have to just write what you love.
yeah, and I think as soon as you are published, there's that kind of fear that keeps you going, if you hope that people keep wanting to read it, and
Yeah.
you've just got to trust that you've carved a niche for yourself, and you can evolve. Like my friend Mia Kushnia started off with these really popular children's books about pirates, Ship of Shadows, and she's had a really successful adult book, Midnight in Everwood, and they're different, but they still feel like her, and she's still kind of
Mm-hmm.
building her brand. And you've just got to trust, haven't you, that the editors will pluck you out because you're still doing what you love, and
Yeah.
the readers will kind of follow you. Hopefully not with hers. Readers won't be reading both books, maybe, but maybe when they're a bit older, they'll read them both. So I'm just going to check if there's anything else. Oh, that was it. So I wanted to know, like in terms of middle grade horror, you said that in the US it's having a real moment. Is there anything that you can recommend to either US or UK readers if they like Fright Watch? What sort of things would you recommend they read alongside them?
Oh, there's so much good. Like, I haven't read one. I want to say like, this is the genre that I have not read a middle grade horror book out there that I haven't really enjoyed. And this is also the genre that I can give to my most reluctant readers at school, and they will read to the end. They'll still say, I hate reading. I just liked that one book.
Yeah.
But like, it will get kids in. So I'm actually part of a spooky middle grade group, which is called Spooky Middle Grade. So we have a website, and all of us have
Oh,
our
cool.
books listed there. So there's a bunch that I can recommend from that group. Authors like Adriana Cuevas, who wrote The Total Eclipse of Nestor Lopez, and she's got a couple more books coming out that are spooky. Kim Ventrella, J.W. Oker. There's so many really, really great middle grade books. So if you're interested, I would direct you to the Spooky Middle Grade website.
Awesome. In that case, I will link to that in the description, and I will go to it myself and buy all of the books, probably, because they
Yay.
sound so good. I mean, I love my YA, but I think that reading your books has made me think I haven't read that much middle grade recently. And when I do, I tend to be maybe reading books by people that I know, but I read sort of contemporary ones. So yeah, I'd love to get my teeth. I keep saying get my teeth into. I'm writing too much Mina and Slayer stuff at the minute.
Never
Sink my
too much.
fangs into the middle grade horror. That's really cool. Thank you for those recommendations. So I always like to ask a couple of kind of silly questions towards the end. If you've been sucked into a horror movie and you want to bring some characters with you to ensure your survival, they can be from books, films, TV. Who would you pick?
I would I'm gonna go with movies.
Okay.
Characters from movies. I would pick Sydney Prescott from
She
Scream.
does have a good track record, doesn't she? So.
She has such a good track record. I hope they don't ruin it with.
No,
I feel like all
yeah.
hope is lost if they kill Sydney.
Yeah,
Prescott.
I know. Every Scream film, I'm worried that this is going to be the one.
Yeah, I was worried with this one.
Yeah.
I would bring Dustin from Stranger Things. Stranger Things is my heart right now, and I would struggle picking which character, but I feel like Dustin would make me laugh. And he's smart, so I would pick him. And I would pick Nancy from The Craft, which is probably controversial because she does terrible things, but she's super powerful and she would protect me.
If she was on your side, she would be the best person to have. If she was against you, you would be in serious trouble.
I would be in trouble, but we would be friends in this world.
That's really cool. They're good answers. I feel like you've covered a range of abilities there. You've gone from like brute force magical strength to smarts and keeping you happy in a life or death situation. Good answers. Yeah, I tend to just say Buffy is that answer because she's just my favorite.
Well, she's kind of all of those things in one person.
I know. I think I'm sure people get fed up. Like, pick another person for an answer, but she just is my genuine answer. And Spike, is the answer, the other answer to the question of which like male love interest would I include myself. Like, I'd just take Spike and Buffy with me, and then I'd be happy.
There you go.
On all fronts. I'm just going to check if there's anything else. Oh yeah, so I thought we'd do some quick fire questions, and I just want you to say the first thing that comes to your head. I'll try not to argue with you too much if we disagree. We're getting on really well so far, so I think we should be okay. Favorite vampire?
Lestat.
That was a good answer. I won't argue with that. Favorite movie, hero, heroine, character, whatever you want to call them?
Probably Sydney Prescott. That was like the first horror movie I saw like on my own in a theater, and love her. Yeah,
I watched it at a sleepover. It was my first like horror sleepover film, and we were all absolutely too scared to sleep, so it did its job really well. Favorite movie villain?
Hi, Nancy. Going back to The Craft.
Yeah, she is awesome and so multifaceted. Can't say the word, multifaceted, and really well explained, sort of without kind of pandering to it, like why she is how she is,
the way she is.
Book or movie that scared you as a kid?
The Exorcist.
Yeah.
My best friend in middle school was just like so unafraid of anything. She would laugh through every horror movie and loved them. And we rented I think Exorcist 1, 2, and is there a third one? We rented all of them. And I was like frozen in horror, and she's laughing through it. And it was so bizarre. Yeah.
We did that with the Poltergeist films. I don't know how many Poltergeist films there are, but at a sleepover once we had a good range of them, and I don't even know that we watched them in order or the right ones. And I sat there feeling absolutely terrified. And there were some people that were just like, "Oh, this is so funny." Like, it's not funny for me. I'm nearly crying, but it's interesting. My brother still isn't that into horror as an adult. Like, he's now not, nightmarishly scared of them, but he's just not into it. And I think it's those early horror films. It's how you react to them, isn't it? You either you're in it and you're kind of a horror fan and that's it, or your first experiences are just like, why would you want to be scared? That's just not for me. It's very interesting psychology, I think. And do you have any favorite horror tropes either to watch or write about?
Kids on bikes, that I'm really into that. I like writing those scenes. I like reading those scenes. I like watching movies or like TV shows like Stranger Things, those moments where and I just started to watch, I don't think it's horror, I think it's sci-fi, which might be why I didn't like it as much as I wanted to, but Paper Girls, that new show, it's based on a graphic novel. I only watched the first episode, but it's like girls on bikes, where weird things are happening, and I love that. I don't know if it started as a trope, but I think it definitely is now. Like, we've crossed over.
Yeah, just I was smiling when you said that because it made me think of the Goonies, which is not horror, obviously.
Yeah.
But it's
it can transcend into...
and like Stand By Me, like The Body, the Stephen King story. I think that it's as soon as you get these kids in those situations, you can then take it off in different directions. You can make it the kind of contemporary Goonie adventure, and you're rooting for those kids and you want them to be okay, or you can make it the horror where you're rooting for those kids and you don't want them to die horribly. Yes. I know I interviewed Kat Ellis and I asked her.
Oh, I love her.
I know, she's great, isn't she? And her kind of silly question was, which two films would she combine? And she said The Goonies and The Descent. And I was like, Kat, why would you do that to those children? But also, you're a genius.
I feel like that should be her next book.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? How just you can take a little bit from one thing and a little bit from another and like destroy somebody's soul. And I told my husband that, and The Goonies is his favourite film, and he was like, why would you do that?
Like, don't do that. Don't hurt Mikey.
Yeah, I know. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think part of what I do love about horror is that's why It is still one of my favourite horror books. I know that it has its problems. And when I read it as an adult, I was like, I read this as a child. Like, there's scenes in here that I must have just skimmed over because, they haven't necessarily aged well. But it is so terrifying because you really care about that group of children and then adults. And you just really desperately want them to survive. And being Stephen King, that they're not all going to make it.
Yeah.
And it's great. maybe that's a good note to end on, like Stephen King and is
Come
amazing.
full circle.
And as we know, he loves you, and there's not many people that I can say that to. I think you're among a very small number of people. Like you're the only person I've actually spoken to who's been blurbed by him. So if you're even in any doubt as to reading Lorien's books, that should tell you that you have to read them. Stephen King loves them. So last question: can you tell us anything about what you're working on now?
I am working on another middle grade horror, but it is not part of the Fright Watch series.
Oh.
It's a standalone, and it's kind of like The Conjuring for kids.
Oh, that's a good blurb. I like that.
So I know I've like dabbled in ghosts before with the collectors. These are very different, way scarier entities. And it is dual point of view, which I haven't really played with before. And yeah, it's quite a different vibe from Fright Watch, but still scary.
Oh, I kind of want that now. That's so frustrating, isn't it? You know how publishing works. It's like I'll just have to wait 2 years or something to read that.
Yep. That's exactly right.
Thank you so much, Lorien. I knew we'd love talking to each other and have lots to say. I hope that everybody watching has enjoyed that as much as I have. A link to Lorien's books in the description. Please do check them out because they're amazing. And as ever, I appreciate everybody who's watched right to the end. Likes and subscribes are always appreciated. And I have got some other exciting horror author interviews lined up soon, so keep an eye out for those. And thanks so much, everyone, for watching. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.